It was a quiet morning when the widow stepped out of the car and looked up at the grand gates of her late husband's estate. The world outside believed this place was a symbol of wealth and power, but to her, it held memories she was afraid to face. The air felt heavy as she slowly walked through the gates, the sound of distant murmurs already reaching her ears. His family was inside, waiting, watching, and judging even before she stepped through the door. She paused for a moment at the entrance, taking a breath to steady herself. She knew the day would not be kind. Ever since the news of her husband's death spread, people whispered things about her. They said she married him for money, that she was too young, that she didn't belong in this world of luxury. She had learned to ignore those things while he was alive, because he protected her in ways no one ever had. But now he was gone, and she had to walk into a room full of people who never accepted her. Inside the mansion, the family gathered around the long wooden table in the hall. The room was lined with tall windows, letting in soft light, but it didn't brighten the mood. Almost every chair was filled by relatives she barely knew, and none of them looked pleased to see her. Most turned their eyes away when she walked in, but she could hear their whispers. There she is. She came to take everything. I knew she'd show up. She kept her gaze down, trying not to let their words reach too deeply. She took a seat near the end of the table, hoping to draw as little attention as possible. A lawyer stood at the front, going through papers, preparing for the reading of the will. The silence felt sharp, broken only by the faint ticking of a clock and the rustling of papers. Across the room sat her husband's eldest son, staring at her with a look she had seen many times before. It wasn't simple dislike. It was anger mixed with something colder. He had never hidden his belief that she didn't deserve to be part of the family. Others shared the same thought, and today they made no effort to hide it. She folded her hands in her lap, trying to stop them from shaking. She told herself to stay calm, to stay quiet, to be respectful, even though no one was willing to offer her the same. Her eyes drifted toward the corner of the room, where a large piano stood. It was polished, clean, and untouched. She remembered sitting at that piano with her husband late at night. He would listen while she played simple melodies. He was the one who encouraged her to start again, reminding her of something she lost long before they met. Music was the first thing she ever loved, and he was the first person who made her feel safe enough to return to it. She looked away quickly, not wanting anyone to see the emotion in her eyes dot. As the lawyer finished sorting the documents, the murmurs grew louder. A few relatives leaned close to one another, whispering things they didn't bother hiding. She's only here for the money. Everyone knows it. He was old enough to be her father. She played him. She'll walk out of here rich while we get nothing. Their words were sharp, meant to hurt, and each one felt like a stone thrown at her heart. But she didn't respond. She never did. She knew anything she said would only make things worse. The lawyer finally spoke, his calm voice cutting through the tension. He explained how the reading would proceed and asked everyone to settle. Chairs shifted, breaths slowed, and all eyes turned toward him. But even in that moment, the widow could feel the weight of the room pressing against her dot as she sat there. She couldn't forget the last moments she had with her husband. He held her hand with a gentle grip, his voice soft as he told her not to let anyone make her feel small. He knew what the world thought of their marriage, and he knew how hurtful it could be. But he always believed in her heart, and she clung to that memory as a source of strength. The lawyer cleared his throat again, preparing to read the first section of the will. The room grew completely silent, the kind of silence that made her stomach twist. She waited, trying to prepare herself for whatever was written, though she had no idea what her husband had planned. Then the tension in the room broke as the eldest son leaned forward and spoke loudly on purpose. "Let's get this over with." Some of us already know who's trying to take everything here. A few others murmured in agreement, throwing glances at her as if she were a stranger who had walked into a home that didn't belong to her. The lawyer didn't respond to the comment and continued with his work. But she felt the sting all the same. She closed her eyes for a moment, reminding herself to breathe, reminding herself that she had every right to be there. Her husband had loved her. That was the truth, no matter how many people wanted to twist it. As the lawyer explained a few formal details, she noticed that more relatives were staring at her now. Their expressions were cold, curious, and full of assumptions. They didn't know her story. They didn't know how much she sacrificed or how deeply her husband cared for her. The room felt colder than when she arrived. Her heart felt heavy. Still, she didn't let her shoulders drop. She sat upright, silent but steady, trying her best to show strength without saying a word. In moments like this, the absence of her husband felt especially painful. He had always stood between her and the cruelty of others. But now she faced it alone. She glanced at the piano once more. Something about it gave her a strange calmness, as if the memories connected to it were trying to hold her together. The lawyer finally announced that the reading would begin soon. People leaned back in their chairs, bracing themselves for what they believed was rightfully theirs. The widow sat quietly, her hands clasped, her mind full of the past and the uncertainty of what was coming. She didn't know what would be revealed or how the family would react. All she knew was that the truth had a way of reaching the surface, even through noise, even through hate. And deep inside, she hoped that maybe, just maybe, today would be the day her husband's voice would be heard one last time, clearing the shadows that surrounded her. She didn't dare imagine what the will contained. She only hoped it would speak for her in ways she couldn't. For now, she waited quietly, unaware that this day would change everything, not because of money, but because of something far more powerful waiting to unfold. The room felt colder as the minutes passed. The widow sat still, her hands folded in her lap, trying to stay calm while every whisper, every sharp glance, and every muffled laugh seemed aimed straight at her. She had expected tension, but the open hostility from the family still cut deeper than she wanted to admit. They didn't see her as a human being. They only saw her as an obstacle standing in the way of what they believed belonged to them. The lawyer began preparing his notes again, making small adjustments to the stack of papers. The family members grew impatient. They shifted in their seats, sighed loudly, and exchanged glances that said more than words. Some glanced at the widow with smirks, others with narrowed eyes, as if waiting for her to break. She didn't. She kept her gaze down, focusing on her breathing. She thought about the mornings she used to sit beside her husband, holding a cup of tea he made for her even when his hands trembled. He always smiled at her, always asked if she slept well, always spoke with kindness she didn't experience anywhere else. Those memories gave her strength. A woman sitting across the table leaned toward another relative and whispered loudly enough for half the room to hear. "If she thinks she'll walk away with everything, she's dreaming." Another voice responded, "She was only with him for the house and the bank accounts." Everyone knows that. The widow felt her throat tighten, but she didn't lift her head. She didn't want them to see her pain. Showing emotion would only give them more fuel. Then the billionaire's eldest son leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and spoke as if he were the one in charge, not the lawyer. "We all know what this is. She pretends she's the innocent one. She'll act shocked when she hears how much money he supposedly left for her. But she won't fool me." He didn't look at her when he said it. He didn't need to. The words were thrown into the air like stones. The widow kept her eyes on the edge of the table. She knew that arguing wouldn't help. Nothing she said would change their opinions. They had already decided who she was. and nothing, not even the truth, would matter to them. The lawyer finally cleared his throat, trying to bring the room back to order. "Please," he said gently, "let's try to maintain respect. This is a sensitive moment for everyone." There was a brief silence before someone muttered, "Respect goes both ways." The widow stayed silent. The lawyer continued organizing the documents, but the energy in the room remained sharp. The widow could feel the eyes on her. She wished, just for a moment, that she could disappear from that place. But she couldn't. She had promised her husband she would be present when his will was read. He wanted her there. That mattered more than their cruelty. As she tried to focus, her gaze drifted toward the grand piano again. Something about the instrument felt comforting, like a quiet friend in the corner. She remembered how her husband would sit beside her while she played, listening with a peaceful smile on his face. He used to tell her the piano made the house feel alive. She didn't play often, but when she did, he always asked her to play that one special tune, slow, gentle, full of emotion. She blinked back a tear and looked away quickly. The eldest son finally broke the silence again. "Are we going to sit here all day, or can we get started? Some of us already know we're about to be cheated." The lawyer looked at him with patience only a long career could build. "I'm waiting for everyone to settle," he said quietly, but the room refused to settle. A chair scraped loudly as another relative stood up, pacing a few steps before muttering, "I can't believe we're wasting our time on this." He barely knew her. Another voice added, "Exactly. She came into his life out of nowhere. And now suddenly she's the one who gets everything?" The widow felt a sharp ache in her chest, but she pressed her lips together and kept her head down. She wouldn't defend herself. She didn't need to. Her husband knew the truth of their relationship. He knew how they met, how their love grew slowly and unexpectedly. He knew the sacrifices she made that no one else was aware of. And that was enough. Still, the sting of their words felt heavy. The lawyer finally raised his hand. "If everyone could please take their seats, we'll begin." People reluctantly returned to their chairs, though their irritation didn't fade. The widow glanced around the table, quietly observing the people who had never once asked her how she was. Even after losing someone she loved deeply. As the lawyer opened the first document, someone on the far end of the table whispered, "I bet she already knows what's in there. He probably told her everything." "Of course he did," another replied. "He trusted her more than his own family." The widow felt her fingers curl slightly. That last remark wasn't meant to be kind. It was sharp, dripping with resentment. The lawyer adjusted his glasses and looked over the room. "Before we begin," he said, "I need to share something important. There is a personal note written by the late owner. It will be read after the legal portions of the will." A wave of murmurs filled the room. A personal note? For who? Probably for her. The eldest son shook his head in irritation. "This is unbelievable." The lawyer calmly tapped the stack of papers. "The note will be read at the end." It was his request. The widow felt her heart beat a little faster. She didn't know about the note. Her husband hadn't mentioned anything. What could he have wanted to say after his passing? The thought brought warmth and fear at the same time. The eldest son leaned forward again. "Why is that necessary? Why not just read the will? Everything else is pointless." "It was his request," the lawyer repeated firmly, "and we will respect it." The family members shifted again, some rolling their eyes. The tension thickened even more. The lawyer turned to the first page, but before he could begin, another relative raised her hand. "I have a question," she said, not bothering to hide her suspicious tone. "Did he change his will after marrying her?" All heads turned to the widow. The lawyer answered professionally. "Yes, there were adjustments made in the last year of his life, but all changes were legally approved, and he was of full mind when signing. A loud scoff came from the end of the table. Full mind? He was sick. He wasn't thinking clearly. She probably influenced him. Another muttered, "Of course she did." The widow swallowed hard. She felt her shoulders tense. These accusations weren't new. She had heard them before, whispered in private corners. But hearing them openly, spoken without shame, felt different. She wanted to speak up just once, to say she never asked for anything. But she held the words inside. The lawyer tried again to start, but the family continued. What exactly did she do for him? She wasn't around before. She didn't help build this family. She took advantage of him when he was vulnerable. She doesn't deserve a cent. Their words grew harsher, each one layered with anger and bitterness. The widow breathed slowly, refusing to let the tears rise. Finally, the lawyer raised his voice, not loudly, but firmly enough to silence the room. Enough! We cannot continue like this. If we do not show respect for the process, I will pause the reading until order is restored. The eldest son glared at him, but didn't respond. Slowly, the noise died down. The widow lifted her eyes for the first time since entering. She looked around the table, not with anger, but with a calm she didn't fully understand. She didn't want their approval. She only wanted fairness. The piano stood behind her, silent but steady. She wondered if her husband had known this day would unfold like this. Maybe that was why he left the note. Maybe he knew she would need his voice one last time. As the lawyer finally began reading the legal details, the tension tightened again, but no one spoke. The widow listened quietly, not knowing what would come next, not knowing that soon the entire room would see a side of her they never imagined. For now, she simply waited, unaware that the moment that would silence them all was drawing closer with each passing minute. The reading continued slowly, the lawyer moving through the formal parts of the will, while the family listened with tight faces and stiff shoulders. The widow tried her best to stay focused, but her heart remained heavy from the hostility surrounding her. The long table felt like a battlefield, with each breath from the relatives sounding like a warning of what was coming next. She sat quietly, almost shrinking into her chair, hoping the storm would pass soon. Nothing in the early part of the will involved her. It was mostly about business shares, old properties, and small items the billionaire had promised to different relatives long ago. Some family members softened, only for a moment when they heard their names attached to something they wanted. But whenever the widow shifted or even breathed too loudly, the tension returned instantly. She didn't react. She didn't move much. She simply waited. The lawyer paused for a moment and flipped to another page. His expression changed slightly, like he had reached a part of the will that needed careful handling. The family noticed. What now? Someone muttered. The eldest son leaned forward again, irritation filling his voice. If this is the part where everything goes to her, just skip the fake explanations. The lawyer shook his head. This section is important. It includes a personal request made by your late father, something he insisted be honored during the reading of the will. The room grew strangely quiet. Even those who disliked the widow leaned in a little. Personal requests from the billionaire were rare. He was not a man who shared his private thoughts easily. What request? The eldest son asked sharply. The lawyer took a slow breath. Your father asked that a specific piece of music be played today, and he wrote clearly that his wife should be the one to perform it. Silence, the kind of silence that didn't feel. Peaceful, more like disbelief, frozen in the air. Then the whispers began. You're joking. He wanted her to play? She can't even play anything. This is ridiculous. The widow felt her heart tremble. Her husband had asked that? He never told her. He never hinted at it. Why would he put something like that in his will? Her hands suddenly felt cold. The eldest son laughed once, a short, bitter sound. Let me guess. He wanted her to entertain us. The whole thing is nonsense. The lawyer did not smile. This was extremely important to him. He wrote it in his own handwriting. The widow's pulse quickened. She stared at the piano in the corner, the same instrument she had been trying not to look at for the last hour. Her husband had loved when she played, but she never believed he would ask her to perform in front of his entire family. The eldest son stood up, shaking his head. No, I refuse to sit here and watch her pretend to be some kind of musician. This is not part of legal proceedings. The lawyer remained calm. It was his final request, and as his legal representative, I am obligated to honor it. Another relative scoffed loudly. Why would he ask her? She probably hasn't touched the piano in years. The widow looked down at her hands, her fingers trembling slightly. They didn't know she had avoided playing since the day she lost someone dear long before the billionaire came into her life. Music reminded her of pain she tried to leave behind. She only played for her husband because he asked gently, kindly. With a patience she had never experienced. She hadn't touched a piano since he passed. A voice from the other side of the table cut through her thoughts. This is just another way she make us look like fools. She pretends she's emotional, maybe cry in the middle of it. It's embarrassing. The widow raised her eyes, her face calm but unsure. She didn't want to embarrass anyone. She didn't want attention. The idea of walking to that piano made her heart pound in her ears. The lawyer spoke again, gently this time, as if understanding what she might be feeling. He asked you to play the piece he loved. It's written clearly. We cannot continue the reading until that request is carried out. The room erupted. You're stopping the reading for a song? This is insane. He's gone. Why do we have to follow something so strange? The eldest son glared directly at the widow. Go on then. If this is what you wanted, show us. The widow flinched slightly at the harshness in his voice. She looked at the piano again, her breath shaky. She wanted to honor her husband. She wanted to respect his words. But she was afraid of playing in front of those who hated her. Afraid that her hands would shake. Afraid she would fail in the one thing he had asked of her. The lawyer stepped aside and nodded toward the piano. Take your time, he said softly. Her chair felt heavier than ever. She stood slowly, her legs weak, the wooden floor sounding louder with every step she took. The room watched her, their eyes fixed on her with a mixture of judgment, disbelief, and curiosity. When she reached the piano, she placed her hand on the smooth surface. A soft breath escaped her. The instrument felt familiar, yet strange, like meeting an old friend after many years apart. She pulled back the bench and sat down. The keys gleamed under the warm light. She gently rested her fingers on them, but her hands trembled too much to press even a single note. Behind her, someone muttered impatiently. Another whispered something insulting. A few whispered that she would embarrass herself. The widow closed her eyes. She remembered her husband's voice. The way he always said, play the way your heart speaks. Not for the world, just for us. A deep breath filled her chest. When she opened her eyes, she let her fingers glide across the keys, touching each one with the same tenderness she used to show him. But she couldn't play yet. Not with the noise behind her. I can't do this, she whispered softly to herself. The lawyer stepped closer. You don't have to impress them, he said quietly. You're doing this for him. His words steadied her. The widow looked at the keys again. Slowly, her fingers curved, remembering a melody she thought she had forgotten. A melody filled with warmth, sorrow, and love. She struck the first note. It was soft, trembling, almost unsure. A few relatives scoffed, but she ignored them. She pressed the second note, then another. Slowly the melody began to form, fragile but real. The room fell quieter. though not silent. The eldest son leaned back, unimpressed. Someone else whispered, "She's just tapping keys." But the widow didn't stop. She let the music flow gently, her fingers moving with growing confidence. Each note seemed to lift a weight off her heart. She let herself remember why she played, who she played for, and how much it meant to him. Not tears gathered in the corners of her eyes. But she didn't let them fall. The melody grew stronger. The room finally began to fall silent. Even the harshest relatives paused, confused by the softness turning into something deeper, something they didn't expect. But before she could reach the heart of the piece, her fingers suddenly froze. A sharp memory flashed her old pain, the loss she tried to bury. Her breathing faltered. The room waited. She closed her eyes again. Swallowing hard. Then, quietly, she whispered to herself again. For him. Her fingers touched the keys once more. This time, the music that filled the room was different, not hesitant, not fragile, but full of emotion she had kept hidden for years. Notes poured out like a quiet confession, soft yet powerful. The whispers behind her stopped completely. No one spoke. No one moved. The widow played the melody her husband loved most, the one that carried a story only the two of them knew. By the time she reached the final note, the entire room had changed, but she didn't notice their faces. She simply sat there, her hands resting on the keys, breathing deeply, unaware that she had just silenced the room, not with wealth, not with power, but with something far greater. She didn't look back yet. She didn't know that the moment she turned around, everything would be different. For now, she just breathed. The morning of the will reading arrived with a quiet chill in the air, the sort of chill that made every breath feel a little heavier. The sun had just begun to rise, its pale light slipping through the tall windows of the mansion where everyone had been asked to gather. The house, usually full of life when its owner was alive, now felt like a museum slowly waking from sleep. No one spoke much, and even the staff walked softly, careful not to disturb the strange silence that had settled in. She stood near the doorway of the grand hall, trying to calm her hands. Every step she took felt heavier than the last. People were already gathered inside: relatives, business partners, a few friends, and of course the family lawyer. Their faces turned towards her the moment she entered, and she could feel the weight of their eyes. Some held cold curiosity. Others held judgment that even the quiet room couldn't hide. No one needed to say it out loud. She had heard the whispers for weeks, some spoken behind her back, some said boldly right in front of her. They thought she had married him for his wealth. They thought a young woman like her couldn't possibly care for a man much older, a man carrying a vast fortune, a family legacy, and a name people took seriously. But she knew her truth, and no amount of gossip could erase what she had shared with him. Still, facing these people made her uneasy. She held her breath for a moment and tried to gather courage. The lawyer gestured for everyone to take their seats. She quietly chose one near the back, knowing that sitting near the front would only draw more attention. Yet even at the back, she felt eyes studying her every move. The lawyer cleared his throat and began speaking in a steady voice, explaining the formalities. He opened a thick folder, placed his glasses on the bridge of his nose, and began reading the late billionaire's words. His voice echoed softly across the hall. He spoke about gratitude, about lessons learned, about people who had shaped his life. There was warmth in his words, even humor in a few lines. And the room seemed to relax just a little, but every person there was waiting for the same thing: how the wealth would be divided, and more importantly, what had been left to his young wife. A few glances swung her way again, but she kept her eyes fixed on her hands. She did not come here to defend herself, and she did not expect kindness. All she wanted was to honor his wishes. The lawyer continued reading, and she could feel her heart beating faster with each passing moment. When he finally reached the section concerning her, the room seemed to tighten with a quiet tension. In my final days, the lawyer read, I asked her to promise me one thing, that she would continue living her life with honesty, courage, and the freedom to pursue the passion she once gave up for the sake of others. A soft murmur traveled through the room. She slowly lifted her head. The lawyer paused, then continued, To her, I leave something more personal than wealth. I leave a message and a request, one she already knows. People leaned forward. They expected a shocking twist, maybe a confession or a hidden secret. But instead, the lawyer reached into the folder and pulled out a single envelope sealed in deep blue wax. He looked toward her. He wanted you to open this after the reading. Her breath caught. She slowly stood up, walked to the front, and accepted the envelope. The wax shimmered under the warm light. She returned to her seat, holding the letter gently, almost afraid to open it just yet. The lawyer continued reading the rest of the document, detailing distributions to his children, charitable foundations, long-time employees, and business responsibilities. Those parts flowed smoothly, causing small waves of nods and quiet comments. But every person in the room kept glancing toward her, waiting for her reaction to the mysterious envelope. When the lawyer finally said, This concludes the reading, the hall grew quiet again. For a few seconds, no one moved. Then the shifting of chairs, the soft clatter of shoes on the polished floor, and quiet murmurs filled the space. People began approaching the lawyer or each other, already discussing details. She sat silently, staring at the envelope resting in her hands. It felt heavier than paper, heavier than the entire will. Her fingers trembled as she finally slipped her thumb under the seal and broke it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, written in his handwriting, the handwriting she had watched so many times when he scribbled notes to himself or wrote little reminders for her. She unfolded it carefully. My dear, the letter began, When you read this, I will no longer be beside you. I know people will doubt you, and I know their judgment will hurt you. But you must not let their voices bury your truth. You gave up your passion for the piano because life pushed you into responsibilities too early. I saw the way your eyes lit up every time you touched the keys. I never forgot the night you played for me, when the entire world seemed to fall away. I want you to share that part of yourself again. She swallowed hard, her eyes beginning to sting. I have made arrangements, the letter continued. When the time feels right, there will be a moment meant for you, a moment to let your music speak. And on that day, no rumor, no whisper, no doubt will stand taller than your truth. A tear slid down her cheek. She gently folded the letter and placed it back inside the envelope. Suddenly, she felt someone watching her. She looked up to find several faces turned in her direction. Some looked curious, others impatient, and a few openly suspicious. It was clear they wanted to ask about the letter. They wanted to know what she had been given, what secrets had been hidden inside. She took a slow breath, stood up, and quietly walked out of the hall. The air outside felt cool and comforting as she stepped onto the stone path leading to the garden. The mansion's garden had always been a calming place. He used to say it was the one part of the house that held no judgment, no expectations, just beauty growing freely. As she walked down the path, memories began to rise. She thought of the first time he took her into this very garden, when he told her that the world was full of noise, but music had a way of carving out a small, quiet place inside the heart. She remembered how he had encouraged her to play again, even when she insisted that those days were behind her. Now, reading his letter again in her mind, she understood why his tone had felt so meaningful in those final days. He had been preparing her for this, preparing her for the moment when people would doubt her. and preparing her for the moment she would need to stand strong. She sat on a stone bench beneath a tall tree. The branches shielded her from the soft wind, and the leaves made a gentle sound above her. She closed her eyes and allowed the quiet to settle around her. For so long, she had let rumors overshadow her own voice. She had stayed silent, hoping people would eventually see her truth. But he had known better. He had known she needed to speak in the one language that had always been hers. Music. A distant memory stirred one of the last conversations they had. He had been lying in his bed, his health failing, his breaths shallow. She held his hand and tried not to let her tears fall. "One day," he had whispered, "you will play again. And when you do, it won't be just a performance. It will be your truth, your story, your answer to every doubt." He had paused, gathering strength. "Promise me you'll share that part of yourself. Promise you won't hide anymore." She had nodded through her tears. "I promise." Now the weight of that promise felt stronger than ever. As she sat beneath the tree, she heard footsteps approaching. She looked up to see one of the late billionaire's business partners standing nearby. His expression was polite, but she could sense he had come with questions. "Are you all right?" he asked gently. She nodded. "I'm fine." He hesitated, then said, "People are talking. They're wondering what he left you. They're wondering what the letter said." She looked away for a moment, then back at him. It was personal. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "If you ever need help navigating all of this, let me know. Not everyone in that room thinks the worst of you." She gave a faint smile. "Thank you." He walked away, leaving her with her thoughts once again. She looked down at the envelope resting beside her on the bench. She touched it gently, as though touching a memory. Somewhere inside the mansion was a grand piano he had restored just for her. She hadn't played it since he passed. She hadn't been ready, but the time was coming. She could feel it, and when that moment arrived, her music would speak for her in a way no explanation ever could. She sat quietly for a few minutes longer, letting the calm of the garden settle her heart. Then she stood, straightened her shoulders, and walked back toward the mansion. The next chapter of her life was waiting. The evening arrived quiet and soft, as if the world itself sensed something important was about to unfold. The mansion, which had been filled with tension during the will reading earlier that day, now sat in a calm stillness. Only a few staff members moved around quietly, preparing things for the guests who had returned after the reading, to pay their respects and share memories. She stood in the hallway, staring at the closed door of the music room. Her heart was beating slowly but firmly, as if reminding her she was still here, still breathing, still capable of honoring the promise she had made. For days she had avoided this room, unable to face the grand piano he had restored for her. The instrument had always been a symbol of what she had left behind, a part of her life she thought she had abandoned forever. But now, after reading his letter, she understood that this moment wasn't about fear or doubt. It was about truth. It was about giving voice to the part of her heart she had buried under responsibility and silence. She placed her hand on the door, hesitated, and pushed it open. The lights were dim, the room smelling faintly of old wood and polished metal. The piano sat near the large window, where the moonlight spilled softly across the floor. She walked toward it slowly, each step stirring memories she had tried to ignore for too long. She remembered the first time he saw her play a simple evening when she thought she was alone in a small hotel lobby. She had played quietly, thinking no one was listening. But when she finished and turned around, he had been standing there, smiling in a gentle way that surprised her. That was the beginning of many things she never expected. She touched the piano bench and slowly sat down. The keys were cool under her fingers, like they were waiting for her to wake them. For a moment she simply breathed, letting the room settle around her. She could almost hear his voice in her mind, soft, encouraging. "When the time feels right," he had written, "let your music speak." And tonight, the time felt right. Outside the door, she heard the quiet murmurs of the guests who had gathered again in the main hall. They were still talking, still whispering their judgments and assumptions. Many of them believed she had only come into his life for wealth and comfort. Some openly doubted her intentions. Others simply didn't understand her. She had kept silent for so long, not because she was afraid, but because she didn't know how to defend herself in a world where rumors drowned out truth. But music had always spoken more honestly than words. She placed her fingers gently on the keys. At first she didn't play, just touched the smooth surface, letting her breathing slow. She closed her eyes and thought of him, not the billionaire people spoke about, but the man who laughed easily, who listened closely, who believed in her talent even when she doubted it herself. Then, without planning it, she pressed down on the first note. It was soft, almost a whisper. But that one note carried more truth than anything she could have said out loud. She took a breath and began to play. The melody started slowly, almost fragile, like something waking from years of sleep. The notes blended with the warm air of the room, gently filling the space. Every sound felt like a piece of her heart, finally speaking after being quiet for too long. As she played, the music grew stronger. Her fingers moved with confidence she didn't realize she still had. The melody became fuller, deeper, carrying emotion she had kept hidden. She didn't think about the audience outside the music room, or the judgment waiting for her. In that moment, the only thing that existed was the piano, the memory of the man she loved, and the promise she meant to keep. Then a soft sound reached her ears, the sound of footsteps stopping outside the music room. She kept playing. Another set of footsteps joined the first, then another. Soon, she could sense people gathering outside the door. The quiet murmurs faded, replaced by stillness as more listeners arrived. Someone gently pushed the door open. She didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She could feel their presence, their curiosity, their surprise. Her music continued, rising and falling like a story unfolding. She played not to impress them, not to prove anything, but because this was the part of her they had never seen. This was the truth she had kept hidden behind silence and grief. Finally, her hands slowed. The final notes lingered softly in the room before fading into silence. For a moment, there was no sound. She kept her eyes on the keys, breathing slowly, unsure of how the room behind her would react. Then she heard it, one soft, hesitant clap. Then another. And then the entire room erupted into applause. She lifted her head slightly and turned. The doorway and hallway were filled with people. Some looked surprised, others emotional, and a few deeply embarrassed for ever doubting her. Even those who had been the loudest critics stood frozen, caught between shock and admiration. Someone near the front, woman who had earlier spoken, harshly looked at her with softened eyes. "Why didn't you tell us you could play like that?" She whispered. She shook her head gently. "It wasn't something I needed to prove." The lawyer stepped forward, his expression thoughtful. "He knew you would play tonight," he said quietly, as if he understood something others didn't. She nodded. "He left me a letter. He asked me to share my truth through music." The crowd stayed quiet, absorbing her words. One of his relatives, someone who had been suspicious of her from the start, stepped closer and spoke with a softer tone than before. We thought you came into his life only for what he had." She met his eyes calmly. "I didn't marry him for money. I married him because he made me feel seen, because he believed in me at a time when I didn't believe in myself." The man lowered his gaze, regret touching his face. The room grew quiet again, heavy with the weight of realization. The lawyer then stepped to the center of the room and cleared his throat. "There is something I didn't read earlier," he said. "A message she wrote specifically about today." The murmurs grew again. He unfolded a small note and read, "Tonight, if she chooses to play, let her music remind you not to judge what you do not understand. She is more than what you think, more than the labels you give her. She is the person who stood by me in the quiet moments of my life. Treat her with the respect she deserves." A soft wave of emotion filled the room. Some lowered their heads. Others looked at her with new understanding. She felt a warmth spread through her chest. For the first time since he passed, she didn't feel alone. The room slowly began to connect with her, not as the young wife of a wealthy man, but as a human being with her own story, her own pain, her own death. People came forward one by one, speaking to her with sincerity. Some apologized. Others simply thanked her for the music. A few even shared memories of him, memories she hadn't heard before, but treasured instantly. After everyone left the room, she sat alone at the piano again. She placed her hand gently on the keys, feeling calm for the first time in weeks. She knew there would still be challenges ahead. People didn't change overnight. But tonight had shifted something important. Tonight, her truth had found its voice. She looked out the window, where the moonlight touched the garden he loved so much. For a moment, she felt as if he were standing beside her. "I did it," she whispered softly. The piano sat quietly. But the room felt full of memory, full of promise, full of hope. And as she sat there, she knew that this moment was not an ending, but the beginning of a life she could finally live without fear, without doubt, and without silence. A life where her music would always speak for her.